There is a secret world of yachts, mansions, and million-dollar fortunes that hides in plain sight every day. A world we hardly ever have access to and rarely hear about, but one that directly impacts our governments and, as a result, our lives. This is about a tool used by the most powerful people in the world, a kind of Swiss Army knife for multimillionaires. In this video, I open the door to this worldwide and show you how. Two lawyers set up a kind of Panama Canal for dirty money, tailor-made for organizations, the rich, and criminals. In 1945, Nazi Germany had just been defeated by the Allied forces in World War II. While American troops patrolled the rubble, the Nazis, who were not yet back on their feet, hid like rats. 14 years earlier, Panama faced a military coup. Ramon Mura, a former dentist armed with a revolver, was among the group that later, the government of Florencio Arosemena. After the first successful coup d'etat in Panama's history, he held the position of Secretary of Infrastructure for 9 months until a new president was elected by the same armed group that carried out the coup. The new head of state was Armodio Arias Madri, who, due to having different ideals, removed Mura from office as soon as he came to power, leaving Mura out of the government that he himself had helped to set up. The years went by until Armodio's brother Arnulfo Arias took power in Panama. He was openly an admirer and supporter of the governing styles of Hitler and Mussolini and tried to put Little Panama on the path to totalitarianism. A year after being elected, he was overthrown by the Panamanian National Police. With some encouragement from the United States, which was watching everything closely and trying to keep things under control on the western side of the Iron Curtain, the Mora family's activism left behind a turbulent legacy where Ramon Mora's grandson and namesake would experience the third coup d'etat in Panama's history. Now, with the dictator Omar Torrijos rising to power, Ramon Fonseca Mora was 16 years old and was a young activist who had just dropped out of school. Attracted by Jesuit ideals and very fascinated by the idea of becoming a priest and, according to him, saving the world. The members of the Jesuit order organized secret meetings where students could meet with other people interested in social reform in Panama. At one of these meetings, Ramon Fonseca met the man who would become his friend and mentor, Father Héctor Gallego. Father Héctor Gallego practiced liberation theology, a school of thought within Christianity, which means that it is the Church's role to liberate the oppressed, including helping these oppressed people achieve better socioeconomic conditions. He carried out his work in a parish in Santa Fe, in the province of Veraguas, Panama, which was one of the poorest regions in the country in the 1960s. The province was marked by extreme poverty, hunger was common, and illiteracy rates reached as high as 90%. They didn't have access to clean water, and the church estimated that at least half of the children suffered from malnutrition. Invited by Father Héctor, Ramon Fonseca moved to Veraguas and contributed to various Catholic church projects. One of the tasks that Ramon did quite often was to bury the children from the community who died. Many of them were still newborns, victims of hunger and the lack of basic sanitation that plagued Veraguas. People basically lived off family farming, but in feudal economic conditions, serving a few wealthy families who controlled or owned the very few businesses that existed there. And besides the oligopoly, they also gave out loans with the intention of further enslaving people through debt. A kind of class conflict happened when Father Héctor formed a cooperative that helped families sell the produce from their land. In Veraguas and beyond, breaking the strongman's control and improving socioeconomic conditions as the church advocated was challenging. One Veraguas elite member, for example, was Omar Torrijos' cousin. They launched a violent campaign against the church's movement to put an end to all of that, under the pretext that the movement could become radicalized against the government. As the days went by, the atmosphere became increasingly tense, leading to army retaliation against members of the church and the general population. This even led to soldiers setting the priest's hut on fire one night. But even so, he stood firm and refused to stop the movement. In his last congregation, with his followers and supporters, he left a very clear message to everyone. Ramon Fonseca spent months witnessing deaths and injustices, but he still believed in the power of the church. Finally, the events of the night of June 9, 1971, deeply affected young Fonseca, who hadn't yet imagined becoming a lawyer. While Father Hector was visiting the home of one of the families, two soldiers arrived in a jeep. They knocked on the door, interrupting the priest's visit, and invited him to go to the army base. Reluctantly, Father Hector said he was very tired and would walk there the next morning. The soldiers insisted, and Father Hector realized what that invitation at that hour of the night was really about. He took a deep breath and accepted his fate, said goodbye to his family, and got into the car. After that night, he was never seen again. Many Panamanians believe that he was pushed out of a helicopter that was flying at night over Coiba Island off the southern coast of Panama. At the time, there was a maximum security prison there for murderers, rapists, and political opponents of Omar Torrijos' government. After these events, Ramon Fonseca was haunted, but he was advised by the Archbishop of Panama to keep preaching the gospel as a way to keep his friend's message alive. But in the end, he chose to leave his life in the church and went back to college, where he started studying law. Possibly because of the murder of his mentor and also because of the futile outcome of his grandfather's struggle. He learned what happens to men who try to change the world, or at least Panama. But where was Mossack? And what events would lead the two future lawyers to meet and become partners? 2 months after the Nazi defeat, in 1945, American soldiers captured the corporal of the Waffen-SS Totenkopf, the division known for being the bloodiest of the Nazi regime.
Calm down.
They're coming here.
Who's coming?
The Germans.
It's a damn SS battalion.
The prisoner's name was Erhard Mossack, who, at 21 years old, was a failed product of Hitler's dream for Germany at the time. Since, before serving in the Totenkopf, he also received at 15 a good dose of the doctrine preached in the Hitler Youth, even becoming a class leader. A few months after his capture, Erhard and other prisoners managed to steal a truck and escape from the prisoner camp in France, where they were being held under the custody of American soldiers. He and his comrades almost made it across the border to Germany, but the French sentry troops made their plans difficult. He and two companions managed to escape by running, and after days of traveling in hiding, they eventually arrived in Cologne. He separated from his prison companion and blended in with the population. He ended up finding a doctor who secretly removed the tattoo of his former army division. Then, after disguising his Nazi past, he got a job as a helper on a nearby farm without drawing much attention to himself. Even though he tried to live another life, some former German officers looked for him at the farm and invited him to join a secret society in order to, who knows, maybe one day in the future, re-establish Nazi rule in Germany. None of this worked out very well, since a few months later, American intelligence located and captured the members of that society, and that included Erhard. During his interrogation, he said that he had infiltrated those Nazi organizations in order to obtain information, precisely to negotiate his freedom since he was still wanted as a prison escapee. At the very least, a flimsy excuse from someone who was caught off guard, but in the end, it worked for the Americans. After being released, Erhard got married and supported his family by working as a journalist for a local publication. In 1948, his first son, Erhard Jürgen Mossack Erhard, was born. Erhard had 3 more children before the family packed their bags and moved to Panama, following a wave of post-World War II German immigration to all of Latin America and Central America, including Brazil. When Erhard arrived in Panama, he started working at Lufthansa. He held several positions over the years, where he possibly obtained a series of insider information. There are records that in 1963 he contacted the CIA to offer information about communist Cuba in order to make some money. But there's nothing that proves what kind of relationship he had with American intelligence, if there was any at all. And so, at 13 years old, Jürgen Mossack ended up in Central America, a young German, the son of a hardcore Nazi. Very shy and unable to speak a word of Spanish or English, he was surprised by the heat of the Panamanian climate and millions of kilometers away from his old home in Europe. Limited by the language barrier to communicating only with his own family, he had zero friends and a lot of difficulty making new ones, practically forced to be an introverted teenager. Years later, Mossack enrolled in a law course at a private university in Panama. At that point in his life, Fonseca was still burying children's bodies in Veraguas. When Mossack graduated, he specialized in maritime law. And Fonseca, when he graduated, was invited to fill a position at the United Nations since they needed representatives from Central America to meet the quota. Fonseca lost during his United Nations tenure the little bit of faith he still had in his ideals because the other distinguished members always approached him with indecent proposals. They practically begged for his services as a lawyer, since Panamanian law made it so that only Ramon, being Panamanian, was able to create offshore companies for his colleagues at the United Nations. Panama has always allowed foreigners to anonymously buy companies in the country, the so-called offshores, which are basically shell or phantom companies. Panama didn't care about these companies at all. It only required them to have a legal representative who didn't necessarily have to be the real owner. These shell companies don't actually do anything, they're just used to hold assets. And as long as the money for these companies came from outside Panamanian territory, they didn't have to pay taxes, which made them practically exempt from any tax burden. Panama even offered to register ships. And with that, companies could dodge taxes and labor laws that would be required in the process if it were done in their home countries. These relaxed policies of Panama suited them very well, from yacht owners to companies like Standard Oil, the largest oil company of its time, which in 1919 had its entire naval fleet registered in Panama. This climate of tax evasion led to Mossack and Fonseca crossing paths for the first time. Adnan Khashoggi was a billionaire arms dealer, well known for his involvement in the Iran-Iraq war. He registered the Nabila in Panama, a yacht named after his daughter, which was more like a floating palace than anything else. For the modest sum of $250 million, you could be the owner of the Nabila. It could sail about 14,000 kilometers without needing to refuel, and it could store enough food for 100 people for 3 months. It was also equipped with a movie theater, a ballroom, and a range of amenities that ordinary people like you and me may never see in this lifetime. Nabila sailed the seas with the most distinguished guests on board, people from Arab royalty, executives from Fortune 500 companies, bankers, government officials, and the list goes on. The yacht would start its engines and head to international waters when needed. And once outside the jurisdiction of any government, the guests would start conducting business and signing paperwork, taking advantage of a sort of legal blind spot. The billionaire reputation of the yachts preceded Adnan, who also flaunted a bohemian lifestyle. This attracted a sheikh, who was a client of Mossack, who as a lawyer was still working alone at the time. The sheikh was interested in buying another mega yacht from Adnan. But all the grandeur of the vessel still wasn't enough for him. It was still missing a helipad. Adnan agreed to sell the yacht. The lawyers in charge of the paperwork were Mossack and Fonseca, who shook hands while working on all the documents for their respective clients. This was the very first time the pair worked together. In 1981, Omar Torrijos died in what many believe was a political assassination. His plane crashed, causing Panama's stability to collapse. Once again, Manuel Noriega took power, sinking even deeper into a sea of controversy and hostile internal politics. United in an opposition movement against Noriega, Mossack and Fonseca decided that a partnership made a lot of sense, both from a business perspective and to stay strong. After all, a lawyer alone wouldn't be able to stay safe, nor would he be able to handle all the demand. At a party, glasses clinked, signaling what was to come. That's how the Mossack-Fonseca firm began. Panama experienced chaos under Noriega's rule. Protests, street tire fires, and Noriega's cartel ties. It was bad for Panama's image, so it was also bad for Mossack Fonseca's flagship business, the shell companies, which were based in Panama, specifically speaking. The two knew they would have to look for other jurisdictions in order to keep selling their services, but these jurisdictions had to offer conditions just as good as those in Panama. So, a series of business trips were made to other tax havens, and as a result, a number of other branches were opened. How did Mossack Fonseca make money? Setting up a shell company in the firm's early years cost about $1,000. The firm also made money by handling any transactions, such as opening bank accounts, transferring money, or signing contracts. In addition to the renewal of the company, which was charged annually. For a fee, the firm could also provide a proxy for the client, charging about $45 per proxy signature. Mossack Fonseca legally provides anonymity to the ultra-rich. Although these amounts may seem small for an international scheme this large, the reality is the opposite due to the huge demand for these services. Adelina Mercedes was an employee of the firm who was simply the legal representative of more than 27,000 companies created by Mossack Fonseca, both inside and outside Panama. Some other employees of the company, just like her, had as part of their job to fill out documents like that one. The firm served clients with various needs, from someone who wanted to avoid excessive taxation, which could be arranged legally, even reaching people who wanted to protect their assets through these shell companies. For example, a divorcing couple. The husband could transfer his assets to one of these companies, and when it finally came time to divide the assets, his fortune would remain untouched. This was possible thanks to something called bearer shares, which is basically an instrument that determines who holds shares in the company. In this case, it determines who would actually be the owner. This would be, for example, like a deed to a house, but the difference is that the owner of the house is whoever literally has the deed in their hands. So, in theory, I could give you a house simply by handing you this document, but a super rich person getting divorced would never hand over bearer shares to a future ex-wife. But Mossack Fonseca didn't just deal with small fish and petty squabbles. The firm had its most very important person clients, who were people or organizations that required extra care and attention, so to speak. Lionel Messi is considered by many to be the best soccer player in the world, and in fact, he is very skilled both on and off the field. Mossack Fonseca took care of Megastar Enterprises, an offshore company that, in theory, was used as an instrument to evade about 4 million euros in taxes. The company had 5 attorneys, and Messi himself, along with Jorge Horacio Messi, who is his father and manager, were the real owners. Not only through Megastar Enterprises but also through other companies. The Messi were allegedly evading taxes since 2005, as these offshore companies were also used to negotiate Messi's commercial image rights for companies like Adidas, Danone, and any others interested in using him as a spokesperson. These companies would need to wire transfer funds to the Panama account, as other methods would incur taxes. So, supposedly, besides being a good player, Messi would also be a good tax evader. To be honest, it's nothing new that soccer stars are involved in this kind of scheme. Even Nico Rosberg was hired by Mercedes through a Caribbean offshore company. But it's surprising to see that even those who regulate sports are deeply involved in the offshore game. Juan Pedro Damiani was a Uruguayan lawyer who had been part of none other than Federación Internacional de Fútbol Asociation's ethics committee since 2006, the year it was founded. His law firm based in Uruguay was a client of Mossack Fonseca, which, over the years, founded around 400 offshore companies. For them, a kind of B2B relationship developed between them. All the offshore companies were created with the purpose of handling bribes intended for people connected to the top ranks of Federación Internacional de Fútbol Association. This scandal involved the names of Hugo Jinks and his son Mariano Jinks, who owned Full Play, an Argentine company responsible for negotiating the broadcasting rights for the Copa America friendlies. According to the FBI, the father and son paid bribes to the top ranks of Federación Internacional de Fútbol Association in exchange for more lucrative broadcasting rights for Full Play. And through the services of Mossack Fonseca, they were able to move millions, buying the ethics and morals of anyone necessary for the scheme to work. This scandal, called Federación Internacional de Fútbol Association Gate, also implicated the former Brazilian Football Confederation president. He was even accused by a federal judge in New York of being a cancer that corrupted Brazilian sports. Sometimes the ball rolling on the screen makes us forget about the complexity and corruption that happens behind a simple match of our favorite team. But even if we change the channel, Mossack Fonseca will still be behind the scenes, since even Jack Chan was a client of the firm. He had in total 6 companies managed by Mossack Fonseca, with the most prominent one being Dragonstream. But despite no illegal activity from them, the simple fact that he was a client of a firm that serves several figures from the offshore underworld is reason enough to raise some eyebrows. It is speculated that the main reason for the creation of Jack Chan's companies is tax evasion, to keep China's attention off the actor's money, which is also why the offshore companies were opened. From Simon Cowell, Emma Watson, Donald Trump, Tina Turner, Paul McCartney's ex-wife, his father, David Cameron, and the son of the former United Nations Secretary General. All these people and many more were allegedly clients of Mossack Fonseca and used their services for various purposes. But away from the tropical heat of offshore havens, some Russian personalities also joined the Mossack Fonseca party. For quite some time now, the world has suspected that Vladimir Putin is secretly the richest man on Earth. At the very least, his watch collection, valued at over 22 million rubles, doesn't really match up with the story of his salary, which, according to sources, is around $140,000 a year. Curiously, Putin's name is absent from all records and reports, while all his friends' names are listed. Supposedly, Mossack Fonseca provided several offshore companies for his friends, with special attention to Sergei Roldugin, who is said to be the mastermind behind the dirty schemes of Putin and his oligarch friends. Through the offshore companies, the oligarchy managed to corrupt several sectors of the Russian economy. This included everything from the National Bank of Russia to KAMAZ, a truck manufacturer that many consider to be responsible for the best trucks in the world. Discussing how Putin's oligarchy corrupts Russia makes Mossack Fonseca, the video's topic, seem as trivial as a prank call to a pizzeria. If you want to know more about this, I'll leave a card up here so you can find it more easily and watch it later. A video where I talk more about this suspicion surrounding Putin. In 2016, an anonymous message appeared on the computer screen of investigative reporter Bastian Obermeier, who worked at the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung. The name Andan is equivalent to John Doe in our Portuguese, and to this day, this person remains protected by anonymity. This person was responsible for leaking about 2.6 terabytes of confidential files from Mossack Fonseca dating back to 1970. The invisible world of offshore accounts was no longer so invisible, and many other stories like the one I told you came to light. As I mentioned earlier, Mossack Fonseca didn't just deal with petty squabbles and small fish. And besides television and sports celebrities, a number of other politicians from all over the world were exposed in the leak. To mention a few who are no longer in office today, there was the Prime Minister of Iceland, Australia, Italy, Ukraine, and the United Kingdom. The list goes on and even includes the caliphates of the Arab world, such as the King of Saudi Arabia, the President of the United Arab Emirates, the former Emir of Qatar, and so on. Altogether, there are about 140 political figures in key positions across all the countries of the planet. Some offshore companies set up by Mossack Fonseca were exposed for moving millions to support Bashar al-Assad's dictatorship in Syria. But going back to South America, these leaks, which became known as the Panama Papers, couldn't have happened at a more opportune time, since this was the icing on the cake of the highly controversial Operation Car Wash that was going on around here. Ricardo Honorio Neto, Mossack Fonseca's representative in Brazil, allegedly emailed subordinates warning that federal police were heading to the firm's São Paulo office. In the email, he urged prompt destruction of the files. Unfortunately, the timing wasn't ideal for the firm. The federal police entered the office and dozens of documents were seized by authorities. The documents revealed how this world of offshore companies, which hides in plain sight, operates here in Brazil. At least 107 shell companies were created for the 57 people involved in the Lava Jato scandal. And that's when we Brazilians feel firsthand how the scheme works. Mossack Fonseca set up companies to hide the identity of the real owners of a triplex in the Solaris building, the one involving Lula. The property wasn't the same one, but rather a neighboring one, and in the end, they found out it belonged to the publicist Nelsie Workin. It was also discovered that, supposedly, the Marinho family had a mansion in Paraty, which was built illegally in an environmental preservation area. As usual, it would be under an offshore company set up by Mossack Fonseca to keep the Marinho name out of controversy. This explains why some people and media outlets noticed that Globo at that time reported on the Panama Papers case in such a restrained way. Odebrecht, a construction company that was neck-deep in the Lava Jato scandal, shocked Brazil for simply institutionalizing the payment of bribes. They even created an internal department called the Structured Operations Sector, also known as the Bribery Department, which was responsible for handling 10.5 billion reais in bribes. Basically, one of the things Odebrecht did was lobbying, bribing key people so the construction company could win bids, and with that, overcharge for projects. And basically anything except completing a public project cleanly and honestly. At the Mossack Fonseca office in Panama, letters and more letters kept arriving non-stop. Newspapers all over the world were asking tons of questions and trying to poke at the most sensitive sides of both partners. Like, for example, the fact that Jürgen Mossack's father may have been a Nazi. The duo still didn't know the extent of the leak. All they knew was that the newspapers were interested in some kind of sensationalism. According to interviews given by Fonseca, he, Mossack, and the firm in general were being used as scapegoats, while the people behind the offshore companies had plenty of time to burn the evidence. He insisted that the media cameras were pointed at the wrong people. The two lawyers' interviews consistently show a sense of detachment. The firm always tried to make it very clear that their business was simply selling privacy through offshore companies. It's as if they were a car manufacturer. The product is obviously the car. Now what is it going to be used for? Mossack Fonseca washed their hands of it, but things didn't quite work out that way. Arrest warrants were issued and both were arrested and interrogated. Exhausted by media pressure and fired up by the feeling that the real bad guys in the story were the firm's clients, Fonseca spoke out too much and alleged the then president of Panama took bribes from Odebrecht, throwing him to the wolves in a futile attempt to get the newspapers off Mossack Fonseca's back. Things didn't end there, and because of that comment, they were held in jail for almost 3 months while Panamanian authorities searched the firm's office. For Mossack, the experience was traumatic since he spent his 69th birthday behind bars. He had never been in this much legal trouble before, with a traffic ticket being his worst punishment until now. Eventually, they were released on $500,000 bail each. Out of jail, Fonseca reported that he was letting it all sink in and trying to process everything that had happened. Mossack remained upset, as he didn't think it was fair to be treated like a public enemy for things that other firms routinely did. After long and controversial years of business, the firm was shut down. The reason? Reputational crisis. With each passing day, more Mossack Fonseca branches around the world were closed, leaving only the very first office of the firm in Panama itself. And where one day, the rush of interns, the sound of women's heels, and the whirring of copiers made up the daily life of the firm. Now, Ramon Fonseca found himself facing an almost completely empty building. One of the last sentences spoken there echoes and seals this chapter in the firm's history, which was considered the world's largest seller of shell companies. We're not angels, but we're not demons either. The firm Mossack Fonseca is not just a story of corruption. It's also a story about how two men who may have once been morally good came face to face with their more controversial selves. They saw a world that we don't see, a world full of owners and secrets, and decided to sell their services to these people. But for John Dunn, the firm was a cancer. So much so that his main motivation for leaking the Panama Papers was simply to make public the crimes allegedly committed by it. In his view, the firm was nothing more than a tool that served the interests of criminals. And it perpetuated the problems of the modern world, such as income inequality and corruption, for example. But simply put, there are many points of view on this subject, including political points of view. There are those who argue that tax evasion is self-defense, and there are those who argue that taxation is a basic practice for maintaining a society. The Mossack Fonseca case, in fact, is not and never was news. The big leak only named names and, unfortunately, brought more questions and reflections than actual answers. No matter how absurd the truths this case revealed were, it's relatively small compared to what would come a few years later, the Paradise and Pandora Papers. But what about you? What's your view on this subject? What do you think about all of this? Leave your opinion here in the comments. And if you like the content here on my channel, I'll leave a video here from a partner channel that I'm sure you'll like too. It's content in the same vibe in the webdoc style.